Hey, have you ever been absolutely certain about something and been completely wrong? Not wrong about a small detail, wrong about the whole story. Here's what I come to believe after all these years in business and leadership, and honestly in life. We don't make our decisions based on reality necessarily. We make our decisions based on what we believe is reality. And a lot of the time, those beliefs aren't facts at all, they're assumptions. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks: the danger isn't that we make assumptions. Everybody does that. The danger is when we build our whole life on top of one. Stick with me today because by the end of this episode, I want you walking away with a tool you can use for the rest of your life. Not just an idea, a tool. Welcome back to the Shattered Mindset Podcast. Wisdom from life's turning points and defining moments. I'm your host, Melvin Larry, and today we're getting into something I'm calling the assumption trap. This is one of those conversations where I really believe you're going to finish this episode and say, I've never thought about it that way before. And if you know this show, you know that's exactly the standard we hold every episode to. So get comfortable, grab something to write with if you got it close by, because I'm going to ask you some questions along the way that deserve more than a passing thought. This one's worth sitting with, I think. Let's start with the realization at the center of all this. An assumption is simply a conclusion you've accepted without enough evidence to actually back it up. That's it. No proof, no confirmation, just a conclusion you decided to live by. And once you see that, you start to notice how much of your life has been shaped by conclusions you never actually tested. Here's what makes this so tricky: an assumption doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk in the door and say, "Hi, I'm an assumption, and I have no evidence behind me." It walks in dressed up as a fact. It feels like something you know, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. So here's the question I want you to sit with for the rest of this episode: what assumptions are quietly making your decisions for you? Let me tell you a story that illustrates this better than almost anything. Well, just a story. A young woman, look, is preparing a ham. May have heard this story before. She's preparing a ham for a big family dinner. Before she puts it in the pan, she cuts off both ends. Her husband, who's watching her do it, says, "Why are you doing that?" And she says, "That's just how you do it. That's how my mom always did it. So that's how she was doing it." So out of curiosity, she calls her mom and asks, "Mom, why do you always cut the ends off the ham?" And her mother says, "Well, that's how my mom did it. Honestly, I never actually thought about why." So now they're both curious. They called the grandmother who happens to still be with us, and asked her that same question. Grandma laughs and says, "Oh, I cut the ends off because my pan was too small to fit the whole ham." Look, three generations of women cut the ends off a perfectly good ham, following a rule none of them had ever questioned, and the actual reason behind it had disappeared a generation earlier. Everybody just assumed there was a good reason because that's how it had always been done. Nobody in that story was foolish. They were just unquestioning. And notice how the whole thing got resolved, not by someone finally figuring it out on their own, by someone finally asking one simple question. Asked two generations too late, but asked all the same, and the whole thing unraveled instantly. Keep that in the back of your mind as you go through today with me, because it's going to come up again. An assumption can only survive in the absence of a question. The moment you ask it, out loud to an actual person, it either gets confirmed or it falls apart. Either way, you're standing on solid ground instead of a guess. Now, before you get into where this shows up in your life, I want you to I want to give you a little bit of the why behind it because this isn't just a personality quirk, it's actually how the human mind is wired. There's a well known concept in psychology called confirmation bias. Researcher Raymond Nickerson, back in the late 1990s, described it as our tendency to search for and favor information, information that already lines up with what we believe, and to brush right past anything that challenges it. Think about what that means. Once you've formed an assumption, your own mind starts working as a lawyer for that assumption. It goes out looking for evidence to defend it, and it quietly ignores anything that would contradict it. So it's not that you're weak minded or careless, it's that your brain is doing exactly what brains are designed to do. It's just doing it in a direction that can quietly wreck your relationships or your career and your confidence if you never learn to catch it. And here's the part I find most interesting. Confirmation bias doesn't feel like bias from the inside, it feels like being right. That's what makes it so hard to catch on your own. On your own. You're not sitting there thinking, I'm about to ignore evidence. That just look, you don't think that you're just sitting there just about to ignore evidence that disagrees with you. You're just thinking, I already know what's going on here. The bias hides behind the certainty. So the goal today isn't to make you doubt everything you believe. That's not healthy either. The goal is to teach you to recognize the specific feeling of certainty that shows up before you've actually gathered the evidence and to get curious right there instead of closing the case. So let's talk about where this actually shows up in your everyday life because it's not just one place, it's at least five, all right? The first way this shows up is that assumptions create invisible boundaries. You've heard these before. Maybe you've said one of them yourself, okay? I'm too old for that, all right? People like me don't do that. Nobody listens to me anyway. It's too late. I probably wouldn't succeed, so why try? Look, none of those may be true. None of them. But once you accept them, they stop being thoughts and they start being operating instructions. They quietly run in the background of your life and you follow them without ever putting them on trial. Here's what I mean by an invisible boundary. Nobody built a fence around you. Nobody put up a sign that says you can't go past here. You built it yourself out of a sentence you accepted one day and never went back to question. And the tricky part is invisible boundaries feel exactly like real ones. They feel just as solid as a locked door. But a locked door has a lock you can find and a key you can look for at least. An assumption doesn't. It just sits there unquestioned, quietly running your life. I know I've had that happen. Here's a question worth asking about every single one of those limiting statements. Who told you that? And if the honest answer is nobody, I just decided it was true, that right there should be your first clue that you're not standing behind a wall. You're standing behind a shadow. And shadows move the second you're willing to walk toward them. Here's the second way this shows up, and I bet almost everyone listening or watching has lived this exact moment. Someone doesn't return your call or your text, and your mind goes to work. They're mad at me. They don't respect me. They don't care. Meanwhile, the truth might be they're sick, they're overwhelmed, they're buried at work, or they simply forgot. One assumption can damage a relationship that never actually had a problem in it. Think about how much of this plays out over text messages. Someone sends you one word. The word is okay. One person reads that as sounds good. Another reads it as they're upset with me. Another reads it as sarcasm. Another reads disappointment. The text didn't change, the interpretation did. That's the whole trap in one word on a screen. This isn't just something I'm telling you from experience. Researchers have actually studied it. Back in 2005, psychologists Justin Kruger and Nicholas Epley ran a series of experiments on email communication. And what they found was fascinating. People consistently overestimate how clearly their tone comes through in writing. And readers consistently fill in the emotional gaps with their own assumptions rather than the sender's actual intent. In other words, we think we're being clear, we're often not. And the other person on the other end isn't reading our mind, they're reading their own assumptions into our words. Ever seen that happen to you? All right, you're like, okay, I sent that, but that's not what I meant. All right. There's a little funny saying that I learned a long time ago. It says, I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. Anyway, let me get off of that. Let's stretch that out across a career, a marriage, a friendship, a team, people you lead. This isn't a small thing. Research on workplace communication has put the cost of miscommunication and misunderstanding at over $1 trillion a year in lost productivity across American business alone. A trillion with a T. Now, I'm not bringing that up to talk about business today. I'm bringing it up so you understand the scale of what a simple, unchecked assumption can cost. If it's costing businesses $1 trillion, imagine what it's quietly costing your marriage, your friendships, and your peace of mind. Third way this shows up, and this one goes deeper, assumptions don't just shape a moment. Left alone long enough, they become identity. Words like, I've always been shy. I'm just not disciplined. I'm not a leader. At some point, a temporary experience turned into a permanent label. Something you went through became something you believe you are. And once it becomes identity, you stop questioning it. You just live inside it. Here's what I want you to notice about that. A behavior is something you did. An identity is something you believe you are. Those are two very different things. But the mind treats them the same way once enough time passes. You weren't disciplined that in one semester, so you decided you were not disciplined, not a disciplined person. Okay? One semester, and now you're not a disciplined person. You froze up in one meeting, so you decided you're not a leader. One moment in time got promoted to a life sentence. And most people never go back to appeal the verdict. Now, here's something that takes this even further. And I think it's one of the most important things. I'll share with you today this information. It's not just that our assumptions shape or how we see each other. How our assumptions actually about other people can actually shape how they perform. There's a famous study from the late 1960s done by researchers Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. They went into an elementary school and gave every student a standard test. Then they randomly picked about 20% of the students and told the teachers, without any real basis for it, that these particular kids were about to have a big year. Big year of intelligent growth, that is. Here's the wild part. Those kids weren't actually any different from their classmates. The selection was random, but by the end of the year, those randomly chosen students showed significantly greater gains in performance than the rest of the class. Nothing changed about the kids. What changed was the teacher's assumption about the kids. And that assumption shaped how the teachers showed up. Hmm. More encouragement, more patience, more opportunities, and the kids rose to meet it. Now, flip that around. If a positive assumption can lift someone up, a negative one can just as easily hold someone down. If you've already decided someone's lazy, unreliable, or difficult, watch how differently you treat them and watch how that treatment can end up creating the very behavior you assume was there in the first place. That's not just about teachers and students. That's you and your spouse, you and your kids, you and the people on your team. Your assumption about someone doesn't just describe them, it can actually shape them. So let's get practical for a minute because I don't want you to leave, with just the problem. I want to leave you with something you can actually do. Here's a simple four-part check you can run anytime you feel that certainty rising up or uncertainty. All right. The kind of certainty that says, I already know what this means. Name the fact, just the fact. Strip away every ounce of interpretation and say out loud or write down exactly what happened. Not what it means, just what happened. Name the story. Ask yourself, what story am I telling myself about this fact? And be honest, because usually there's a story running that you haven't even fully admitted to yourself yet. Name at least one other possible story, just one. You don't have to believe it, you just have to prove to yourself that another explanation is possible. Because the moment you can name a second possibility, you've broken the trap. You've moved from certainty back to curiosity. And then go ask, not ask yourself, ask the actual person. Remember the ham story? Nobody solved that mystery by sitting alone and imagining better explanations. Somebody finally picked up the phone and asked. That's the step that turns this from a private mental exercise into something that actually resolves. A question costs you a moment of feeling a little exposed. An unspoken assumption can cost you a relationship, an opportunity, or years. Naming a second possible story gets you out of certainty. Actually, asking is what gets you the truth. I've lived this myself more than once. There have been moments across my life and my career where I let an assumption make a decision for me before I'd even tested whether it was true. Let me tell you about one of the stories, okay? Now, look, I was driving my family home to Georgia years ago. My after a trip to Memphis, my two boys at the time they were curious teenagers at the time. All right, and they were with me and my family, my wife. We were crossing a long bridge between Tupelo and Fulton, Mississippi. Long bridge at night. When a belt broke on my car right there on that bridge, stopped. All right. Look, as I got out of the car, uh, across the highway on the other side, coming the other direction, a another car had stopped, a pickup truck actually, and a police car had pulled up behind it. Well, the policeman got out, walked up to the pickup truck, said a few things to the driver. Next thing I know, he driver got out. The police officer pulled a shotgun out of that guy's truck and was ejecting the shells out of it. Clack, 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 clack. Now, I'm standing across with my boys who are curious. What's going on, Dad? What's going on? And I'm like, sit down somewhere. Okay. And then a police car pulls up behind me. lights on. All right. Now, look, I'm from the South, and we're in Mississippi, and this is happening. A car across the street, the police officer behind me. My boys are teenagers that are, rambunctious teens. So a lot of stuff was going on in my head. I was more than uneasy, more than uneasy. And so, all of the assumptions were going on in my head. The police officer came up, asked me what was going on. I told him, it seems like a belt broke on my car. He said, okay, I'm going to get a tow truck. I'm like, okay. So the tow truck comes, pulls in front of my car, backs up to my car to hook it up. I'm still uncertain. I don't know what's going on. He hooks up to the car, said, look, I'm going to tow your car to the shop. And he tows my car and tows it around to the car dealership, which wasn't far. Actually, it was the next exit. Backs it up, unhooks it, and he says, I'll have a guy to look at your car in the morning. I'm going to take you and your family to a hotel. I'm still uncertain, okay? He takes us to a hotel, and then I'm thinking, all right, so I go in the hotel. Maybe they're going to rake me over the coals. I only got so much money, and I go in the hotel. They give me an unbelievably good rate, nice hotel, and I'm thinking, okay, this is interesting. I get up the next day. The driver said, I'll come and get you in the morning about such and such time. This is crazy, right? So he does, comes to get me, takes me over to the dealership where my car was. The owner of the dealership comes out and says, hey, I'm the owner of this dealership, and this is your car, right? He said, I'm going to make sure that they take care of you, give you a good price to make sure that you and your family can get back on the road safely. Did that. The price was unbelievably low for the work they did. I got on. Now, here's the deal. I made an assumption that was totally wrong about everything. Hey, look, I know that there are things that happen and there are things that go on, but in that moment, for that time, my assumption was wrong. Okay? And so, it's just to know, listen, every assumption that I had in me started to rise up, right there in the moment, even before the officer even said a word. Okay? But look, wherever your own story comes from, that was mine for that time. The pattern is usually the same. There was a moment, there was a belief you attached to that moment, and that belief quietly outlived the moment itself. See, assumptions limit opportunity too. In business, in your career, in relationships, in your health, in leadership, more often than we'd like to admit, we eliminate ourselves before anyone else even gets the chance to. We don't apply, we don't ask, we don't step forward, not because someone told us no, but because we assume the answer before we ever have anyone to give us one. Like the young lady who said, excuse me, she said she wanted to be a cheerleader, and she said, well, they're probably not going to choose me anyway. Now, she was talented. She had everything it took to be a cheerleader for her high school, but she just said they're probably not going to choose me anyway. Look, I've just watched this happen in different ways. In business, more times than I can count, somebody assumes the client will say no, so they never make the call. I've done that. Somebody assumes they're not qualified, so they never submit the application. Somebody assumes the timing is wrong, so they wait for a year that never actually arrives. And here's what's sobering about that. Every one of those outcomes looks identical to actual rejection. From the outside, I didn't get it, and I never asked. Look, they just look the same. I didn't get it. I never asked. They look the same. Okay? but they're not the same thing. One is a closed door, the other is a door you never even knocked on. I think about this in terms of a simple ratio. Every assumption that stops you from acting has a cost, and that cost almost never shows up right away. It shows up later as a version of your life that quietly narrowed, one untaken chance at a time. You don't feel each individual decision, you feel the accumulation years, years down the road. When you look up and wonder why the door seems to be so much smaller than it used to. I want to take a minute here and speak directly to anyone watching or listening who leads people. Whether that's a team at work, a household, a ministry, a small business, it doesn't matter, all right? Doesn't matter the size. Leadership is where assumptions get expensive because your assumptions don't just shape your own decisions, they shape the decisions of everyone who's watching you and following your lead. If you assume your team already knows what you meant, you stop explaining yourself clearly and things fall through the cracks. If you assume someone's underperforming because they don't care instead of asking what's actually going on, you lose a good person you could have kept. If you assume the market's going to reject your idea before you ever test it, you kill it in the boardroom of your own mind before it ever sees daylight. I've mentored a lot of people over the years, and if there's one pattern I keep seeing in people who plateau, it's this. They stop asking questions and they start assuming answers. The moment you think you've got someone or something completely figured out, it's usually the exact moment you stop actually paying attention to them. Good leadership, and honestly, good relationships in general, require you to keep your assumptions on a short leash. Hold them closely or loosely. Be willing to update them. Second, excuse me, be willing to update them the second new information shows up. The best leaders I've known aren't the ones who walk in with the most answers. They're the ones who ask more questions before they act on a conclusion. That simple habit, asking instead of assuming, is worth more than almost any other leadership skill I could teach you. Let me point a picture for you because I think this will sound familiar to almost everybody listening, even if the specific details are different. Think of someone you know, maybe it's you who had a falling out with a friend, a sibling, a business partner over something that was never actually said out loud. One person assumed the other was pulling away on purpose. The other person assumed the first one didn't want to be bothered anymore. Neither one of them was actually right, but both of them acted like they were. Months go by, maybe years. Two people who used to be close now barely speak. And if you ask either one of them why, they'll tell you a story built entirely on assumption, never once tested against reality. That's how quietly this trap operates. It doesn't usually announce itself with a dramatic blow up. Most of the time, it just erodes something slowly, one untested assumption at a time, until one day you look up and wonder how you got so far from where you started. The good news buried in this, you know, is if if an untested assumption can quietly tear something down over time, a tested one, or better yet, a conversation that replaces the assumption altogether, can just as quietly build something back up. And here's the fifth one. And honestly, this is the one with the most depth to it. Assumptions affect how we see God. how we see ourselves, and how we see other people. A lot of people aren't struggling because of what's actually happening to them. They're struggling because of the meaning they've attached to what's happening to them. Same circumstance, two different meanings, two completely different lives that follow. One person goes through a hard season and assumes, I'm being punished. Another person goes through that exact same kind of season and assumes, I'm being prepared. Same category of hardship, two completely different stories. And the story is what they'll actually live inside of. That's not me telling you which meaning is correct. That's me telling you the meaning you attach matters just as much as, and sometimes more than, the event itself. Here's why all of this happens in the first place. Our minds are meaning making machines. When information is incomplete, we don't sit comfortably in the uncertainty, we fill the gap. Sometimes we fill it correctly, but a lot of the time we're simply creating a story that feels true because it matches our past experiences or our expectations. Think about it like this: your mind hates a blank space. Given an unanswered question, an unreturned call, a look on somebody's face you can't quite read, and it will not leave that space empty for long. It'll fill it, usually within seconds, with whatever story is closest at hand. Usually, that's a story built from your past, not from the actual present situation in front of you. And that leads me to something I want you to remember long after this episode is over. Be careful not to confuse your interpretation with the truth. Let's pause for a moment and pull this together because we've covered a lot of ground. All right? Assumptions create invisible boundaries. They shape how we read other people. Left alone, they become our identity. They limit the opportunities we're even willing to pursue. And they shape how we see God, ourselves, and everyone around us. Five different areas, one root cause, an unquestioned conclusion treated like a fact. Let me ask you a few questions, and I want you to actually answer them, not just let them pass by. How many decisions have you made based on an assumption instead of a fact? Who have you already judged without having enough information to judge them fairly? What dream, what dream have you postponed because of something you only assumed would happen? Where in your life have you mistaken a temporary experience for a permanent identity? And here's the one that changes everything. If that assumption disappeared today, what would you do differently? Okay, don't rush past that. All right, sit with it for just a second, because your answer to that question is usually pointing you straight at what you actually want. Underneath everything you've talked about to yourself or talked yourself out of. Now, this is exactly why I built the SIFT process. SIFT, SIFT process. Because assumptions don't form in a vacuum, they form in the gap between what actually happens and how we interpret it. S, situation. What actually happened? Just the facts. I, interpretation. What story did you tell yourself about it? F, feeling. What emotion followed that interpretation? T, trajectory. Trajectory. What action did that emotion end up producing? Go back to that text for, that text message that was sent, for example. Situation. They text, okay, just the word, okay. Interpretation. They're mad at me. Feeling, anxiety, defensiveness, maybe hurt. Trajectory, you withdraw or you apologize for something you didn't even do, or you fire back a defensive response. All of that from one word. All of that built on an assumption. Let's run one more through it, okay? Because I want this to really land. Say you go for a promotion and someone else gets it instead. S, situation. You didn't get the promotion. That's the fact. And that's all the fact says. I, interpretation, they'll they don't value me. I'll never move up here. F is a feeling, discouragement, maybe resentment, and then T, trajectory. You quietly disengage. Stop bringing your best ideas and start updating your resume out of frustration instead of clarity. Now, watch what happens when you slow down at the interpretation step and ask, is this the only possible story? Maybe it's true, or maybe the other candidate had 5 more years in that specific role. Maybe leadership is already planning to talk to you about the next opening. You don't know yet. And until you know, the only thing that's actually a fact is the situation line. Let's run a third one because I want you to see how this applies outside of work too. Say your adult child hasn't called you in a couple of weeks. Situation, they haven't called. Interpretation, they're pulling away from me. I must have done something wrong. Feeling, hurt, maybe a little grief. Trajectory, you either send a quilt loaded text, a guilt loaded text, or you go quiet yourself and let distance build on both sides. Now run the SIFT process on it. Situation, they haven't called in a couple of weeks. That's it. That's all the fact says. Interpretation, is there another story? Maybe they're overwhelmed with work. Maybe they're dealing with something of their own that maybe they haven't talked about or figured out yet, or how to talk about it. Maybe they've just gotten out of the habit and it's nothing to do with you at all. You don't know which story is true until you actually reach out and find out. But notice what already happened just by running the process. Your feeling softened, your trajectory changed. Instead of a guilt loaded text, you can send a simple thinking about you, would love to catch up. No accusation, no assumption, just an open door. That's the whole power of this tool. It doesn't tell you your feelings are wrong, it just puts a checkpoint between what happened and what you decided to do about it. If you want a simple way to start catching this in your own life, download the SIFT process at go.theshatteredmindset.com slash SIFT. That's go.theshatteredmindset.com / SIFT. It'll walk you through exactly what we just talked about, step by step. A few things I want to leave you with today. Let those sit with you because I think each one of them opens up its own conversation. The mind doesn't just respond to reality, it responds to the story it believes about reality. Everything we've talked about today comes back to that one sentence. An assumption repeated long enough begins to feel like truth. That's how a guess turns into a conviction without a single new piece of evidence ever showing up. Many limits aren't discovered, they're assumed. Most of the walls you run into in life, you built yourself out of a sentence you never went back to question. Facts inform us, assumptions imprison us. A fact gives you information you can actually use. An assumption locks the door and throws away the key. A shattered mindset often begins with an unquestioned assumption. That's not just the title of this show, that's the whole engine behind it. So here's your challenge for this week. I want you to identify one assumption you've been living under. And instead of accepting it, I want you to test it. Ask around it. Look for evidence against it. Give it a real chance to be wrong. Maybe that means having the conversation you've been avoiding because you already assumed how it would go. Maybe it means applying for the thing you assumed you weren't qualified for. Maybe it just means asking somebody directly instead of guessing at what they meant. Or maybe it's smaller than any of that. Maybe it's just noticing in real time the next time you feel that flash of certainty about something or something and pausing long enough to ask, what's the evidence for this? Not where's the feeling, where's the actual evidence? Whatever it is this week, don't let the assumption win by default. Make it earn its place or let it go. Ask yourself this question every time you feel certain about something. Is this actually true, or have I simply believed it long enough that it feels true? That single question asked consistently could become one of the most valuable habits you ever build. And here's something I want just to leave with you. This episode isn't really about assumptions in the abstract, it's about the specific ones that are sitting in your life right now, today, quietly making decisions on your behalf. The relationship you've written off, the opportunity you talked yourself out of, the label you've been carrying so long you forgot it was ever just a guess. You have the ability to go back and forth and put every one of those on trial. Not to be paranoid about every thought that crosses your mind, but to hold your conclusions to a higher standard than it feels true. That's what a shattered mindset really means. Not that everything falls apart, it's that the false ceilings, the ones built out of assumptions instead of facts, finally do. Remember, an assumption is not a fact. It's a conclusion you accepted without enough evidence. And you've got every right to go back and question it. So until the next time, keep adapting, keep evolving, and keep reaching for those new horizons. We'll see you the next time on the Shattered Mindset podcast. Take care, take charge, and God